Welcome back. Just days before this week's Israeli election, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu disavowed his support for a two-state solution, saying he no longer favors the creation of a Palestinian state. Joining us now is Hussein Ibish. He's a senior fellow with the American Task Force on Palestine. Hussein, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Before we get to the future of the two-state solution, what did you make of the election?
Well, I think it's stunning. And I would say that anyone who's surprised by the outcome hasn't been paying attention to Israeli politics. In other words, not a surprise. But anyone who isn't shocked by the kind of politics that have been so widely embraced by such a large group of the Israeli electorate is also not paying attention to the implications. So I would say that my affect, and I think what I would urge people to embrace is not surprised, shocked but not surprised, if you can put it that way.
In the run-up to the election, and this is getting to the future of the two-state solution, Netanyahu said there will be no Palestinian state. Does that effectively end that? Or do we wait for another leader to come along and say, well, it's back on the table?
Well, it doesn't end it in the long run, because until there's another long-term solution that someone can put forward that's plausible, it's out there, and it still potentially could work. However, it does seem to end it as long as he's around and make it very difficult for him to backtrack credibly on that. He had a long history of opposing it. In 2009, he had this famous speech at Bar-Ilan University where he said he accepted it. His actions and other words made it very hard to accept that he had really reconsidered, and now it's clear he hasn't. So for him to become a real supporter and a kind of a midwife of a two-state solution is going to be very, very hard, almost impossible.
How will the Palestinians respond to this? The Hamas position has for a long time been that the Israelis have no intention of a two-state solution to the problem here. Right. Does this now vindicate the Hamas position?
Well, and they also are opposed to it. So I think maybe not really doesn't vindicate the Hamas position, but it is something that Hamas will find politically very helpful. And it will be used by them to legitimate their confrontational stance, that's for sure.
And on the more moderate Palestinian side, you have Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority. This undermines him, doesn't it?
Very much so. And I think it leaves him with very few options except to pursue the internationalization route, the ICC, the UN initiatives and things like that, which are national community, to provide him with alternatives if they don't want him to pursue the ICC and other missions.
Because effectively, given Netanyahu's statement before the election, Mahmoud Abbas has nothing to negotiate.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's the problem. So what does he do? And I think the EU, the United States, and others in the quartet have to ask themselves, what is this party going to do? What are the Palestinians, the moderate, responsible Palestinians, going to do? They've been told they can't have a state by the Prime Minister of Israel. So, I mean, where does that leave them? And if we tell them don't go to the UN or don't go to the ICC, you know, what are we providing as an alternative?
Just before the election as well, the Prime Minister, in the words of one United States newspaper, resorted to race baiting, you know, talking about droves of Arab Israelis going to the polls and they need to be stopped. What did you make of that?
Well, yeah, he spoke of hordes of them descending on voting booths and election places. Yeah, but it was part of this overall dark side of Netanyahu that got more and more play as the election went on and as he became more and more desperate because poll results were not promising to him. And what's shocking is that it is precisely this Netanyahu, this racist, anti-peace, dark Netanyahu, not a new improved Netanyahu, but a new coarsened Netanyahu that has received such a huge mandate from the Israeli public, and it's got to trouble people so that, you know, he's been rewarded for his bellicosity towards the Palestinians, for his racism towards the Arab citizens of Israel, for his confrontation with the Obama administration at the joint session of Congress, etc. All of this has played very well in Israeli politics. It's got to be very disturbing to any responsible person, I think.
Is he going to be able to walk back any of this?
He could walk back some of it, certainly, and he is a pragmatist, so he's going to want, I'm sure, to walk back some, but, you know, it's hard, especially on the two-state solution, given that many people were never convinced that he had ever embraced it. It's going to be very hard to walk back that one, and that's the biggest one.
And the fact that he's disavowed that now, does it perhaps mean that the Europeans will either come under more pressure or will seek more to sanction
I
Israel.
think so.
Yeah.
Yes. I think a harder line Israel is going to draw increasingly pressure from the international community. The Europeans have volunteered to be the point team on that for the West and the international community. I think they'll continue, and I think American resistance to that will also soften. So you'll see more aggressive moves by Europe, less American resistance.
Now, as far as the peace process is concerned, where does this leave the United States?
Well, in a very, very awkward situation, because you have for the first time now, since the peace process really began, in 92, 93, the situation where you've got an Israeli government coming in led by a Prime Minister, Netanyahu, he will be the Prime Minister, who overtly explicitly opposes the bipartisan American goal of a two-state solution. And what's the United States going to do about it? Now, a Palestinian leadership that came in with that position would be ostracized, would be labeled out of compliance with the quartet conditions, and would be deemed, an illegitimate actor. That's not going to happen to Israel for various reasons, but there surely is going to have to be some American soul-searching about this. Either Netanyahu is going to have to walk his position back in a way that the Americans can pretend that this isn't the case, at least, or there's going to have to be a real ratcheting down on the part of the United States of its own commitment to a two-state solution. I think one of the things we have to look for in the coming few years is, does the United States' commitment to a two-state solution get drawn down? Because you now have incompatible positions, the U.S. and Israel. One of them is going to have to shift. Could it possibly be that the Americans shift to accommodate Israel? I don't think it's impossible, but it will be very telling. And if that happens, of course, enormously damaging to the American position.
But realistically, can the Americans now, for instance, say, appoint a new special envoy to the Middle East before they get a clear, unambiguous statement from Benjamin Netanyahu saying, that was pre-election rhetoric, I think differently now, I've changed my mind?
A high-level one to lead high-level negotiations? No, I don't think so. A lower-level one to manage day-to-day stuff? Sure.
We also look at the talks that the P5+1 nations have been conducting with Iran, the nuclear talks. Does the outcome of this election influence those talks in any way?
Not really. It does help to create an international atmosphere of tension around them, and it does sort of raise the stakes insofar as Prime Minister Netanyahu has been rewarded for taking a bellicose line on those talks. But Israel is an irrelevancy in those talks, frankly. Israel does not really dictate to the United States about that. Clearly, the Obama administration is moving forward as it wishes to without paying attention to what the Israelis say.
Would Prime Minister Netanyahu look at this election and its outcome as a mandate to attack Iran, perhaps?
He might if such an attack were plausible, but it's not. The United States has let it be known that it is handling the Iran file. I think here is a situation, unlike the peace process, where you could see the United States move to accommodate Israel. Here you're talking about a direct American national interest that is the #1 priority of the United States in the Middle East. They are not going to care, ultimately, what the Israelis say, and they're not going to let the Israelis, I think, act decisively themselves. I don't think Israel has the capability to do anything that dramatic to Iran's nuclear program, and it really, in the end, will be an American decision, I believe.
Looking at the results after the election, are we going to see an Israeli government that looked very much like the one before the election?
Yes, except that it would probably be even more hardline, and would, I think, there are two possibilities. One is a more hardline version of the same, and the other is a national unity government. That I think Prime Minister Netanyahu might be willing to do that, and President Rivlin wants it. But I think in the end that's not going to happen. Netanyahu doesn't need the center-left. He doesn't need Labour and Kadima and these former Kadima. He doesn't need these parties to his left. He will be just fine with the center-right. And I think it's going to look a lot like the last coalition, but more hardcore.
When you say more hardcore, what are the implications of that?
Well, I mean, I think, for example, Netanyahu has become explicitly opposed to a two-state solution. I think that's not going to be reversed in any dramatic way. I don't see how he can. So you're going to have a cabinet that's going to be, I think, either explicitly or strongly implicitly opposed to peace with the Palestinians, whereas the last one was a matter of debate.
Is this going to lead to greater isolation?
Without question. I think without question, Israel will be more greatly isolated as a result of this. However, as long as the special relationship with the United States remains, and as long as the United States remains a dominant player in the world, that is a kind of security for Israel that it can't be overestimated.
But as you point out, the fatigue factor may get into the United States as well.
It may. It may over time. We'll have to see. I think that on questions to do with the Palestinians, you might see actually the Americans shifting rather than the Israelis. But in the end, the countries have to accommodate each other.
Hussein Ibish, as always, thanks for joining us. Thank you.